In a dusty, forgotten town at the edge of the Wild West, a humble bartender named Sam serves whiskey and comfort to travelers, always keeping a low profile. But when a group of rowdy bikers storms into his bar, challenging his quiet demeanor and testing his patience, they have no idea who they are really dealing with. Sam, far from just a simple barkeep, holds a secret. He's the deadliest shot in the West. What starts as a simple confrontation quickly escalates into a battle of pride and skills. And when the dust settles, the bikers will learn that you should never judge a man by his job or his silence. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The sun was dipping low over the horizon, casting long shadows over the small, dusty town of Red Rock. It was the kind of place where people stopped for a night and never really left, where the horses kicked up dirt as they trudged down the main street, and the wind carried the smell of dry sagebrush and sweat. The town wasn't much, just a handful of wooden buildings, a post office, a general store, and the one thing that brought any kind of life to Red Rock, the Rusty Spur Saloon. Sam had been running the Rusty Spur for years now, quietly, without fanfare. He was a man of few words, a man who preferred the sound of a glass being set on the counter over any idle chatter. He wasn't tall, nor particularly strong, but there was something about him that people learned quickly not to cross. His reputation didn't come from words, but from the way he carried himself and the quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from his every action. Tonight, like many others, Sam was behind the bar, cleaning glasses, wiping down the counter, and keeping an eye on the lone cowboy sitting in the far corner. A man had just walked in before him, his boots dusty from the trail, his face set in a permanent scowl. He wasn't much for conversation either, and that suited Sam just fine. The last thing Sam wanted was to draw attention to himself. But the peace was short-lived. The door swung open with a creak, and a group of bikers strolled into the saloon. The way they entered said it all, like they owned the place. There were 6 of them, all wearing leather jackets with patched emblems of the Black Riders. An outlaw gang known for their troublemaking and their knack for getting into fights wherever they went. The leader of the gang, a hulking man with a scar that ran from his chin to his ear, grinned as he swung the door open wide, letting the evening light spill in behind him. His eyes scanned the room, and a dark, predatory smile spread across his face when he saw Sam standing behind the bar. "Well, well, what do we have here?" the leader called out, his voice dripping with amusement. A little bartender boy hiding in the corner, thinking he can run a saloon in this dead town? You think you own this place? Sam didn't flinch. He had been in situations like this before. There was always someone new looking to test the quiet man. Sam kept his gaze steady, wiping down a glass with a rag as he responded without emotion. "This is just a place for people to drink. You're welcome to have a seat if you've got the coin." The bikers laughed, exchanging glances with each other. They had come to stir up trouble, and Sam's calm demeanor only seemed to make them bolder. They walked up to the bar, their boots making heavy thuds against the wooden floor. The leader slapped the counter with a force that made the glasses rattle. "You don't seem like the type who knows what a good drink tastes like," he sneered. "Let's see if you can handle us." Sam didn't acknowledge the insult. He simply poured a glass of whiskey and slid it down the counter toward the leader. "It's on the house. If you're thirsty." The leader picked up the glass, eyes narrowing. "You think you can just pour me a drink and send me on my way?" He scoffed, tossing back the whiskey in one gulp. "That ain't how it works. You see, I think we're going to have a little fun tonight." He slammed the empty glass back down onto the counter, causing the others to laugh. Sam's eyes remained steady, but he felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He had dealt with rowdy drunks and rough customers for years, but something about this group, their swagger, their cocky grins, made him feel like they were about to push things further than they should. The leader leaned forward, his breath hot with the stench of whiskey and tobacco. "I don't like quiet people," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Quiet ones are the ones who get ideas." "You got any ideas, bartender?" Sam didn't respond immediately. His fingers clenched around the rag as he took a deep breath. He knew better than to draw attention to himself. He had spent too many years keeping a low profile. But there was a stirring in his gut, a memory of his old life as a gunslinger, a life he had left behind. His grip on the rag tightened. "Maybe you should just sit down and have another drink," Sam said evenly. "It's a quiet place. Not looking for any trouble." But the leader wasn't having it. He shot a quick glance at his men, who began to crowd around Sam, their laughter growing louder. "You hear that, boys?" the leader said, his tone mocking. "The bartender doesn't want trouble." He leaned closer to Sam, his eyes narrowing. "I think it's time someone taught you a lesson about who's in charge around here." The leader shoved his hand out, his fingers brushing Sam's arm in a challenge. It was at that moment that Sam's patience snapped. His hand moved like lightning, fast and sure, grabbing the leader's wrist and twisting it with a painful snap. The man's eyes went wide in surprise as Sam moved behind the bar, pressing the man's arm down with precision. Sam's grip was unyielding, his movements swift, efficient, exactly like he had been taught all those years ago. The other bikers froze, watching Sam with stunned silence. Sam's voice was cold, low enough for only the leader to hear. "You might want to think twice before you try anything else. You've walked into the wrong place, and I'm not the man you want to mess with." For a brief moment, the room was silent, the only sound the breathing of the men around him. And then, the leader's face twisted in rage. "You think you're the deadliest shot in the West? You think you can take on all of us?" the leader spat. Sam didn't respond with words. Instead, his fingers slipped into the pocket of his apron, retrieving a small, polished revolver. He didn't draw it. He just let the weight of it speak for itself. The bikers looked at each other, their bravado suddenly deflating. "I don't want trouble," Sam said, his voice even. "But if you push me, you'll find out just how deadly a bartender can be." The moment the cold metal of Sam's revolver was visible, the entire saloon seemed to go still. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath, leaving only the faint creak of the floorboards under the shifting weight of the bikers. The leader's face turned a deep shade of crimson, his eyes flashing with anger. The rest of his gang stood frozen, their earlier bravado dissipating as they realized they were no longer in control. Sam didn't blink. His gaze was steady, unshakable. He didn't need to raise the gun. It was enough just to let them see it. The revolver was a part of him, like an old friend, and the knowledge that it was there, ready to defend, ready to protect, gave him a calmness that could not be matched. The leader tugged at his wrist, trying to free himself from Sam's iron grip, but Sam's hold was unyielding. The man's eyes flicked to his companions, silently asking for backup, but no one moved. "I warned you," Sam said, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight that cut through the tension in the air. "I'm not here to start a fight, but if you insist on pushing, you'll find out why they call me the deadliest shot in the West." There was a long pause, the gang members exchanging uneasy glances. It wasn't just the sight of the gun that held them back. It was the confidence in Sam's voice, the calm in his eyes. These men were used to intimidating people, used to making others cower. But Sam wasn't cowering. He wasn't intimidated, and that shook them to their core. The leader snarled, but then slowly, reluctantly, nodded to his men. "All right, we're done here," he spat, his voice thick with resentment. "But you don't get to disrespect me in front of my men. You just made a big mistake, bartender." Sam didn't respond. He simply released the leader's wrist and let him go. The man staggered back, glaring at Sam with a mix of rage and humiliation. The rest of the bikers backed off, muttering under their breath, but not daring to provoke further. They hadn't expected this, and the realization was slowly sinking in. They had picked the wrong target this time. Sam stood behind the bar, his eyes scanning the room, making sure they weren't going to make any sudden moves. The tension was still thick, but for now, the worst seemed to be over. The bikers exchanged one last look before turning and heading for the door. The leader, still grumbling under his breath, shot one final glare at Sam before they exited the saloon, the door slamming behind them. Sam stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the counter, his grip still firm. His heart was beating faster now, the adrenaline of the confrontation rushing through him. He exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. He had defused the situation for now, but he knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He had handled them, yes, but the Black Riders weren't the type to take a loss lying down. They would be back. He knew it. They'd test him again. They had to. As the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, Sam reached for the rag on the counter, wiping away the sweat from his brow. His hands were steady, though his mind was working in overdrive. He had to be ready for the next round. He glanced at the lone cowboy in the corner, who had been watching the entire scene unfold in silence. The man gave him a curt nod, as if to acknowledge what had just happened, but said nothing. Sam didn't need words. He could feel the man's eyes, the respect that was there, maybe even a little fear. It wasn't often that anyone saw what Sam was capable of, and the last thing anyone wanted was to test it. Sam wiped the counter again, his eyes lingering on the door as if waiting for the next round to begin. But it didn't come. The saloon had quieted down, and the only sound was the soft clinking of glasses as he moved behind the bar. Minutes passed, and just when Sam thought he might be able to relax, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't the bikers returning. It was a man, tall and wiry, wearing a hat pulled low over his eyes. He looked like he'd been traveling for days, his clothes dusty, his boots worn. He stepped into the bar without a word, his eyes scanning the room before they locked onto Sam. Sam raised an eyebrow, still wiping down the counter. He didn't speak. There was something about the man's presence, something quiet and intense, like he wasn't just passing through. Sam could tell this wasn't a man looking for a drink. This was a man with purpose. The man took a few steps forward, his eyes never leaving Sam's. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice low but carrying across the room. "You handled those men pretty well." Sam didn't flinch. He simply nodded, continuing his task. They weren't much of a challenge. The man smirked, the corners of his lips twitching as if in amusement. "Maybe not, but you've made some powerful enemies tonight. The Black Riders don't take kindly to being embarrassed." "I've dealt with worse," Sam replied, his voice calm. "But you've got a point. They'll be back." The man took off his hat and placed it on the counter. "I'd say you've got a plan for that, right?" Sam's hand paused for a brief second. He looked up at the man, his gaze steady. "I don't need a plan. I know how to handle myself." The stranger leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Sam's face. "I'd suggest you get a plan, bartender. You've got a reputation, and there are more men coming to see if it's true." Sam let the words settle, his pulse steady but his mind already working, already preparing for the storm to come. "Then let them come," Sam said, his voice quieter now, but filled with an unshakable confidence. "They'll find out soon enough." The stranger nodded, then turned toward the door, his boots clicking on the floor. "I'll leave you to it then. But remember, when it's time for the showdown, make sure you're ready." Sam didn't watch the man leave. He kept his eyes on the door, feeling the weight of the quiet saloon press in on him. He was ready. The storm was coming, and when it did, he would be prepared. The saloon had returned to its usual quiet hum, but Sam knew better than to relax. The bikers hadn't come back yet, but the stranger's words were still echoing in his mind. The Black Riders were coming. They wouldn't forget the humiliation of the night before. Sam could feel it in the air. Something was about to shift. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each passing minute a reminder that time was running out. Sam continued his work behind the bar, moving methodically, his mind never far from the conversation he'd had with the stranger. Whoever that man was, he wasn't just a passerby. There was something about him, a quiet intensity, that made Sam think he wasn't just warning him about the bikers. He was testing him. Sam had always been good at reading people. It was a skill he'd picked up over years of dealing with all kinds of travelers, some of them good, most of them bad. But every now and then, a man would walk into the saloon and remind him of someone he used to know. Someone dangerous. Someone who didn't just survive the Wild West, but thrived in it. The door opened again. This time, it wasn't the Black Riders returning. It was the cowboy from before, the one who had sat silently in the corner and observed everything that had transpired. Sam didn't acknowledge him immediately, but he noticed the man's eyes scanning the room, sizing up the situation. The man didn't approach the bar right away. Instead, he went to one of the booths in the back, his every movement deliberate, purposeful. Sam wiped down the counter, keeping his thoughts to himself. He could feel the weight of the man's gaze on him, but he didn't give him the satisfaction of an answer. Not yet. Sam had learned long ago that people who were too eager to talk were usually hiding something. But the man wasn't eager to talk. Instead, after a few moments of silence, he stood and walked toward the bar. His movements were smooth, practiced, like he had been in many situations where talking wasn't necessary. He leaned against the counter and looked Sam straight in the eye. "You're Sam, right?" The man's voice was gravelly, worn with the years, but there was a distinct curiosity in his tone. Sam didn't respond right away. He knew the man wasn't asking a question. He already knew the answer. "Depends on who's asking," Sam replied quietly, keeping his eyes focused on the glass he was polishing. The man didn't flinch, didn't seem bothered by Sam's indifference. Instead, he took a long breath, as though considering his words carefully. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man continued. I've seen enough of that in my time. But I've also seen a man like you before. A man who wants to keep his past buried. He paused. You're a gunslinger, aren't you? Sam's grip on the rag tightened just slightly, a subtle sign of tension, though his expression remained calm. The truth was, he had hoped the past would stay buried. The quiet life of a bartender suited him just fine, and it was far better than the bloodshed he'd left behind. But it was hard to outrun your reputation, especially when your reputation was built on the fastest draw in the West. The man took another step closer. I'm not here to bring up old ghosts, he said, his voice softening slightly. I'm just here to tell you that those bikers you faced last night, well, they're just a taste of the storm that's coming. Sam didn't say anything at first. He had been through enough storms in his time to know that this one wasn't going to be any different from the others. But as he met the cowboy's eyes, something about the man's presence made Sam wonder if he knew more than he was letting on. And what do you want from me? Sam asked, his voice low, tinged with the weariness of a man who had been avoiding questions for far too long. I want you to be ready, the man said, his eyes narrowing slightly. You've got a skill that they won't see coming, but they won't stop until they've broken you. You think the Black Riders are the worst they can send? They're not. You've been living in the calm before the storm, but soon, that calm is going to break. Sam felt the stirrings of something deep within him. He had spent too many years hiding from his past. But this town, this life, was his now. And no one, not even the Black Riders, was going to take it from him. The man was still watching him, waiting for a response. Sam set down the rag and leaned in slightly, his voice quiet but filled with an undeniable resolve. If they want to fight, they'll get it, Sam said. But they won't break me. The cowboy seemed satisfied with the response, nodding slightly. Good. I'd be willing to bet that you'll be the one who breaks them. Sam didn't respond. He wasn't one for promises. He knew that actions spoke louder than words, and he had made a decision. He wasn't going to let the Black Riders, or anyone else, take what was his. The cowboy gave him a look of understanding, then stood up, heading toward the door. Before he left, he paused and turned back to Sam. You know, I've heard a lot about you, bartender, and I've got a feeling you're about to remind everyone why they should never mess with a man who's quiet. With that, the cowboy left, the door swinging closed behind him. Sam was left alone in the dim light of the saloon once more. But this time, things felt different. He could feel the weight of the storm on the horizon, and he knew that when the Black Riders came back, and they would come back, they would find a different man waiting for them. The door of the rusty spur creaked open again, just as the sound of a distant engine roared in the distance, breaking the uneasy silence that had settled over the saloon after the cowboy's departure. Sam's hand hovered over the counter, his fingers lightly brushing the edge of the glass, his mind focused on the task at hand, preparing for the inevitable. There was no mistaking it now. The Black Riders would be back. They didn't take kindly to being humiliated, and Sam knew better than to think they'd forget what had happened the night before. He'd seen enough trouble in his life to know that when a gang like the Black Riders was involved, they would stop at nothing to regain control. But something had changed inside Sam. He wasn't just the bartender anymore. He wasn't just the man who poured drinks and kept to himself. The quiet life he'd carved out for himself was no longer enough. His past, the skills he had buried deep inside, were starting to rise to the surface, and he could feel that it was time to face the storm head-on. As Sam turned his attention back to the door, the man who had walked in was a new face, one he hadn't seen before. He was tall, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to be sizing up the room. His clothes were simple, but there was something about him that made him stand out, a confidence, an unspoken warning that he wasn't someone to be trifled with. Sam didn't know him, but there was an unmistakable aura of familiarity in his presence. The man took a few steps toward the bar, his boots echoing off the floorboards as he moved. He was clean-shaven, his hair short and neatly kept. His demeanor was calm, but there was a sharpness about him that Sam didn't miss. The man stopped at the bar and met Sam's gaze. "Ain't often I see a quiet place like this," he said, his voice rough but measured. "I heard you might be the man to talk to about trouble around these parts." Sam didn't say anything immediately. His hand still rested on the counter, but his posture shifted slightly, a subtle signal of alertness. He had been warned that trouble was coming, and now it seemed like it was already here, walking through the door. "I don't know what you've heard," Sam said evenly, keeping his voice low, "but I don't entertain trouble in here. You've got the wrong place, if that's what you're looking for." The man's lips curled into a half-smile, but there was something almost predatory about it. "Ain't looking for trouble, my friend. I'm just trying to find out if you're the one who stood up to the Black Riders." Sam's pulse quickened, so it had already reached other ears. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just nodded slowly, the weight of the situation settling in. Words spread fast in places like this, and if the right person was asking about him, it meant things were already in motion. The man took a seat on the stool across from Sam, his eyes never leaving the bartender. "I've been hearing a lot about you. Some say you were the deadliest shot in the West. Some say you just like to stay in the shadows. I'm starting to think it's both." Sam didn't flinch. He had heard the rumors, the stories that had followed him from town to town. He had never been one for boasting, but there was truth to what the man was saying. The shots Sam had taken in his time weren't just quick, they were deadly. There were few men who could match his skill. Few men who could even hope to come close. But Sam wasn't interested in proving anything anymore. He had left that life behind. "I don't know who's telling you these stories," Sam said calmly, "but I'm just a bartender now. I serve drinks. I don't get involved in other people's business." The man's gaze hardened slightly, the smile fading just a touch. "I know you don't want to get involved, but I've got a feeling you don't have a choice. The Black Riders don't take kindly to losing, and they're coming back. Soon." Sam's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. He could feel the weight of the man's words, the truth behind them. The Black Riders were coming, and when they came, they wouldn't stop until they had gotten revenge. The door creaked open again, and Sam's eyes instinctively flicked toward it. He could hear the low growl of an engine in the distance, growing louder by the second. The Black Riders were on their way back. The man at the bar turned toward the door as well, his expression unreadable. He stood slowly, his hand resting on the counter for just a moment before he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You can keep hiding, bartender," he said. "You can keep your head down and pretend like it's not your problem. But those bikers will keep coming until you stand up to them. They'll bring hell to your doorstep, and they won't stop. You'll either face them and win, or you'll lose everything. You've got a choice to make." Sam watched the man for a moment, taking in his words. It was like the man had read his mind. Sam had been trying to avoid a confrontation, trying to keep his past locked away. But he knew deep down that it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the town. It was about people who couldn't fight for themselves. The man turned to leave, but paused before reaching the door, glancing back over his shoulder. "I'm not here to force you into anything. But I can tell you one thing, Sam. If you don't act now, it won't just be the Black Riders you'll have to worry about." With that, the man walked out, leaving Sam to ponder the weight of his words. Sam stayed standing behind the bar for a long moment after the man left, his thoughts swirling. The sounds of the engines were growing louder now, closer. Sam had always tried to keep a low profile, but now the quiet life was slipping away. It wasn't just the bikers he was facing. It was his past, the skills he had buried long ago, coming back to demand a reckoning. He wasn't just a bartender. And if the Black Riders thought they could push him around again, they were in for a rude awakening. The wind picked up outside, stirring the dust from the road and sending it swirling across the saloon's front porch. Sam watched through the window as the shadows of the Black Riders' bikes grew larger on the horizon. He could hear the rumble of engines, low and steady, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming, the moment he had been dreading and preparing for. The quiet life he had tried to build for himself was slipping away with the sound of every approaching motorcycle. Sam's hand hovered over the counter for a moment, fingers tightening, knuckles white. He had known it was only a matter of time before the Black Riders came back, but he hadn't expected it to feel like this. The calm before the storm was unsettling, and he could feel the tension in his bones, the weight of the choice he had to make. He turned slowly toward the door, the faintest hint of his past coming back to him in the movement. The gun that had once been his constant companion, the gun that had taken countless lives in the heat of battle, now lay tucked away, hidden in the shadows of his mind. But tonight, that gun would be needed again. It was no longer a matter of avoiding confrontation. It was a matter of standing tall in the face of danger and protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves. The door to the rusty spur swung open with a groan. Sam knew that the Black Riders had arrived. He didn't need to see them to know they were here. He could feel their presence, their swagger, as they poured into the saloon, their boots echoing against the wooden floors. The leader, the same man Sam had humiliated the night before, was the first to enter. His eyes locked onto Sam's, dark with anger and humiliation. He had come back for revenge. The other bikers followed in his wake, their faces twisted with rage. They had learned that Sam wasn't a man to be pushed around, but that didn't stop them from trying again. "You should have kept your mouth shut last night, bartender," the leader growled, his voice low and threatening. "You embarrassed me in front of my crew. You think you can just walk around this town like nothing happened? You've got one last chance to apologize." Sam didn't flinch. He didn't need to say anything. He knew the type of man standing before him. This wasn't about a simple apology or a few words of submission. This was about power, about who would walk away from this confrontation with their head held high. "I don't apologize for standing up to men like you," Sam said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet authority. "You came into my bar, made threats, and now you're back to do the same thing. I've told you once, and I'll say it again, this town doesn't belong to you." The leader's lip curled into a sneer, and his hand hovered near the gun on his hip. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't win fights, bartender. Guns do, and you're about to learn that the hard way." The rest of the bikers took their positions around the room, eyes never leaving Sam, sizing him up. They knew what kind of man he was, quiet, calm, unassuming. But that didn't mean they were underestimating him anymore. They had learned that lesson. But tonight, the Black Riders weren't about to back down. Sam's eyes flicked to the door. He knew it was coming. He didn't need to see the guns or hear the taunts. He knew what kind of fight was about to unfold. The question was, would he be able to survive it? He took a step back, his hand slowly reaching toward the hidden revolver beneath the counter. He had carried it for years, and though he had hoped never to use it again, tonight was different. Tonight, he would have to draw faster than he ever had before. As his fingers brushed the cool metal of the handle, Sam's mind flashed back to the days when he had been a gunslinger. The days when he had roamed the Wild West, challenging anyone who threatened the innocent. Those days were long gone, buried under the weight of time and regret. But now they had returned. "You're making a big mistake," Sam said, his voice cold and unwavering. "You're not dealing with someone who backs down from a fight." The leader laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "I don't need to back down. I've got the numbers, the muscle, and a crew that's not afraid to get their hands dirty." As the leader drew his gun, the tension in the room was palpable, every man in the saloon holding their breath. It was a standoff, just like so many before it. But this time, Sam wasn't facing a few drunks or outlaws. He was facing a gang that had made its name by terrorizing towns, pushing people around, and leaving destruction in their wake. The question wasn't whether Sam could fight back. The question was whether he could survive the storm they were about to bring. Sam's fingers tightened around the revolver's handle as he drew it from beneath the counter with a speed that few could match. The saloon seemed to freeze for a moment, time stretching, breaths held, hearts pounding. The leader's gun was still rising, but Sam was faster. In the span of a heartbeat, Sam's revolver was in his hand, aimed and steady, the cold steel pointing directly at the leader. The shot rang out with a sharp crack, and the leader staggered back, his gun flying from his hand as he clutched his arm in pain. The rest of the bikers froze. Their eyes darted from Sam to their leader, who was now on the floor, gritting his teeth and cursing under his breath. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the bartender to be faster. Sam didn't wait for them to recover. He fired again, 2 quick shots, each one finding its mark with deadly accuracy. The first biker went down, clutching his chest, and the second one dropped to the ground, his face contorted in shock and pain. In the blink of an eye, the saloon had transformed from a peaceful haven to a battleground. But Sam wasn't just defending himself now. He was sending a message to the Black Riders, and anyone else who thought they could walk into Red Rock and take whatever they wanted. The remaining bikers, realizing they were outgunned and outmatched, began to hesitate, uncertainty flashing in their eyes. They had underestimated the bartender, and now they were paying the price. But the fight wasn't over yet. The leader wasn't finished. He struggled to rise, fury burning in his eyes. "You think you've won?" he spat, pain and rage seeping into his voice. "You've only just started a war." Sam's gaze hardened. "War's been here for a long time. You just never saw it." The sound of the leader's pained growl echoed through the saloon as he struggled to rise to his feet. Blood dripped from his arm, staining the floor beneath him. His eyes were wild with fury, but there was a spark of realization too. He had underestimated the bartender. And now, Sam could see it in the leader's eyes, the dawning awareness that this wasn't a man to be trifled with. Sam didn't lower his revolver. The room was still tense, the weight of the standoff hanging in the air like a storm cloud just waiting to break. The remaining bikers were frozen, their hands twitching toward their weapons, but unwilling to make a move. They had seen how fast Sam was. They had seen him draw without hesitation and take down two of their own in seconds. But the leader wasn't finished. He gritted his teeth and pulled himself to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice hoarse. "You're wrong, bartender. You've just started a war. The Black Riders won't stop until they've buried you in the dirt." Sam's eyes never left him. He didn't flinch. He didn't flinch when the man picked up his gun with his good arm, his fingers trembling, his breath ragged with pain. Sam didn't even blink when the man aimed it at him. "You're right," Sam said, his voice calm, almost detached. "But you won't be around to see it." Before the leader could pull the trigger, Sam's hand moved faster than the human eye could follow. Another shot rang out, the sharp crack of the revolver cutting through the silence. The leader's gun flew from his hand, the force of the shot knocking it to the floor as the man staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. Sam didn't wait for him to fall. He moved swiftly, closing the distance between them in 2 quick strides. In a fluid motion, he disarmed the leader, knocking the weapon from his hand with a well-placed strike and holding him by the collar with one hand, his revolver now pointed directly at the man's face. The bikers watched in stunned silence. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the bartender to be so fast, so precise. They hadn't expected him to be willing to fight back, to take on the Black Riders, and live to tell the tale. "Listen to me," Sam said, his voice low but full of authority. "You've made a big mistake. I told you to leave this town, and you didn't listen. Now you'll leave with your lives, but know this. If you ever come back, if you ever threaten anyone in Red Rock again, I won't hesitate." The leader's face twisted in anger, his breathing shallow and pained, but he said nothing. He could feel the cold steel of the barrel against his forehead, and he knew Sam meant every word. Sam's eyes flicked to the other bikers, who were still standing frozen by the bar. The threat was clear in his gaze, and after a long moment, one of them took a step back, his hands raised in surrender. "You've got balls, bartender," he said, his voice shaky but filled with reluctant respect. "But you're right. We're done here. We're out." Sam didn't lower his gun until the bikers had turned and headed for the door. He watched them go, making sure they left without any more of their bravado. They weren't even close to being beaten, but for tonight, they were finished. When the last biker exited and the door swung closed behind him, the saloon seemed to exhale collectively, the tension lifting like a thick fog lifting from the land. The remaining patrons who had witnessed the fight sat in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. Some of them exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Sam had done what needed to be done, and for now, that was enough. Sam didn't let his guard down just yet. He stood at the bar, revolver still in hand, eyes scanning the room for any sign of trouble. But it wasn't the bikers he was worried about now. It was what came next. The door creaked again, and Sam's hand twitched instinctively toward his gun. But when he turned to face the new arrival, his hand dropped. It was the same cowboy from earlier, the one who had warned him, the one who seemed to know exactly what was happening before it unfolded. The cowboy's eyes met Sam's, a silent understanding passing between them. He nodded, his hand resting on the counter in a gesture of recognition. "You handled that well," the cowboy said quietly, his voice steady. "But it's not over. You're going to have to finish it, once and for all." Sam didn't need to ask what the cowboy meant. He already knew. The Black Riders had been driven off for now, but the fight was far from over. The storm was still coming, and Sam had to be ready. "I know," Sam replied, his voice grim. "But I don't plan on backing down." The cowboy raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "Good, because if you back down now, you won't just lose Red Rock. You'll lose everything." With that, the cowboy turned and walked toward the door, his boots clicking lightly against the wooden floor. Before he left, he glanced back at Sam. "I've got your back," he said, his voice soft, almost conspiratorial. "But you're going to need more than just a gun to finish this. You've got a town to protect. And there's a reckoning coming." The door swung shut behind him, and Sam was left standing in the quiet saloon once more, his mind racing. The Black Riders had been a challenge, but they were only the beginning. What Sam had to face now was something far bigger than a few outlaws. It was the entire gang, an empire that wouldn't be satisfied until they had taken control of everything Sam held dear. But Sam wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't just a bartender. and the Black Riders would learn that lesson the hard way. The saloon felt like a battlefield after the bikers had left, quiet, the air thick with unspoken tension. Sam stood at the bar, his hands resting on the polished wood, his mind far from the quiet patrons nursing their drinks. His heart still raced, and his thoughts churned with the weight of the decision that loomed ahead. The Black Riders had been beaten back, but Sam knew this was far from the end. It was only the beginning of something bigger. The cowboy's words echoed in his mind. "You're going to need more than just a gun." Sam knew what that meant. It wasn't just the fight he had to prepare for, it was the aftermath. The town was watching him, waiting to see if he would stand strong. And the Black Riders weren't the only threat now. If they came back, and Sam knew they wouldn't come alone. They'd bring their allies, their weapons, their influence. Sam's life had changed that night, and there was no going back. The door creaked open again, but this time, it wasn't the Black Riders or the mysterious cowboy. It was a man, a regular, someone who had been coming to the Rusty Spur for years. His face was lined with age, his clothes worn and faded from years of hard work. He looked like he had something important to say, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the bar before he stepped inside. "Sam," the man said, his voice quiet but urgent. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest. The Black Riders, they're just the start." Sam didn't need to hear any more. He already knew. He nodded, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "I know," Sam replied, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet fury. "They'll be back. But I'm not running. Not this time." The man sighed, taking a seat at the bar, his hands resting on the counter. "You're a good man, Sam. But this town's been through a lot. The Black Riders are the least of your worries. There's more at play here. They're just the muscle. The ones pulling the strings are the real problem." Sam looked up sharply, his heart skipping a beat. He knew the Black Riders were part of something bigger, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. Who was pulling the strings? Who was behind the gang that had terrorized Red Rock for so long? Sam had his suspicions, but hearing this man speak made it clear that there was far more at stake than just a few bikers looking for trouble. "You're saying there's more?" Sam asked, his voice low, his eyes narrowing. "Who's pulling the strings?" The man hesitated for a moment before he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've heard of Jack McCall, right?" Sam's grip tightened around his glass. He had heard the name, but he didn't want to believe it. Jack McCall wasn't just a name. He was a legend, an outlaw so notorious that even the Black Riders would bow to him. Sam had tried to forget about McCall, tried to bury the past and the people he had once known. But hearing that name again stirred up memories he wasn't ready to face. "You're saying McCall's involved with the Black Riders?" Sam asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man nodded. "It's not just the Riders. McCall's been building something, an empire. And Red Rock's part of it. The Black Riders are just the first step. If they take this town, they'll control everything. All the towns, all the people. They've got connections, power. And you're in their way." Sam felt the weight of those words settle into his chest. McCall. An empire. It was all too much. Sam wasn't just facing a gang now. He was facing an empire built on fear, corruption, and violence. And he was the only thing standing in their way. But Sam wasn't about to back down. He had fought too long to protect what he loved. Red Rock was his home. And he wasn't about to let McCall or anyone else take it from him. The man at the bar looked at Sam, his expression grim. "You're going to need more than just your gun to fight this. You'll need allies, people who will stand with you. The Black Riders have a lot of power, and McCall's got connections in places you wouldn't believe." Sam thought for a moment, his eyes scanning the room, his mind working through the possibilities. Allies. He had a few, but he couldn't fight this fight alone. He needed to bring the town together, to find anyone willing to stand up against McCall's empire. "I'll do what I can," Sam said, his voice steady. "But I can't do it alone. I'll need help." The man nodded. "I'll spread the word. There are people in this town who still believe in justice, Sam. They're just waiting for someone to show them it's worth fighting for." Sam stood up from the bar, his revolver tucked securely into his waistband. He had a town to protect. He had a fight ahead of him, and it wasn't just about taking down the Black Riders anymore. It was about stopping a man who had the power to control everything. He walked toward the door, the weight of the task ahead of him settling into his bones. The storm wasn't just coming, it was here. As Sam stepped out into the cool night air, he heard the rumble of engines once more. The Black Riders hadn't gone far. They were circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Sam was ready. This time, the storm wouldn't break him. The cold night air bit at Sam's skin as he stepped out onto the dusty streets of Red Rock. The saloon door creaked shut behind him, but he barely registered the sound. His mind was far from the safety of the bar now. He was standing at the edge of something bigger than himself, something darker. And for the first time in a long time, Sam felt the stirring of an old, familiar fire within him. The Black Riders were just the first wave. Jack McCall, if it was indeed him pulling the strings, was the real enemy. The kind of man who could turn an entire town into a weapon and use fear to carve out an empire. Sam wasn't ready for that, but he didn't have a choice. He had to be. As he walked down the street, his boots kicking up the dry dust beneath him, he glanced toward the far side of town. The sheriff's office stood there, the building dark and quiet under the starry sky. Sam knew the sheriff, a good man, but one who had been bending under the weight of the Black Riders' intimidation for years. He wasn't the kind of man who would stand up to McCall's empire, not without a push. Sam walked past the sheriff's office, his hand on the revolver at his hip, his mind running through the people he knew in Red Rock. There had to be others who would stand with him. He couldn't fight this battle alone. His first stop was the general store. As he walked through the front door, the bell above it jingled, but the store was empty. The proprietor, an older woman named Ruth, had been a fixture of the town for years. Ruth wasn't the kind of woman who would shy away from a fight, but she didn't have the resources to take on the Riders, or whatever McCall was building. Sam found her in the back, sorting through supplies. Her face lit up when she saw him, though her smile was tight, wary. "Sam," she said, her voice low. "I was wondering when you'd be stopping by. Things are getting tense." Sam nodded, keeping his voice low. "I know. I've been hearing things. The Riders, they won't stop until they've taken control. They're working for someone bigger." Ruth's face darkened at the mention of McCall. "I've heard the stories, Sam. Jack McCall is a man who doesn't stop until he gets what he wants. And from what I've seen, he wants this town. He's been working behind the scenes, pulling strings, getting people to turn against each other." Sam leaned against the counter, looking Ruth in the eyes. "We can't let him take it. Not Red Rock. Not without a fight." Ruth hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder at the empty store. The wind howled faintly outside, and the room felt colder somehow. "You're not the only one who wants to fight," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I've seen people in this town who are ready to take a stand. But they're afraid. They're afraid of McCall's men, afraid of what might happen if they step out of line. That's why we need to act now," Sam replied. "If we wait, it'll be too late. McCall's empire isn't just a group of bikers. It's a network. We need to hit them fast, before they can regroup." Ruth nodded. "I'll do what I can, Sam. I've got a few people I can reach. We'll need to move carefully, but we'll help." Sam gave her a firm nod. "Good. I'm counting on you." With that, he turned and left the store, his mind already working on his next move. He had a town to rally, and the clock was ticking. The Black Riders weren't just an annoyance anymore. They were part of something far larger, and the whole town of Red Rock was in the crosshairs. As Sam stepped back into the dusty street, the sound of engines began to grow louder once more. This time, the sound was different. It was sharper, more deliberate. The Black Riders weren't hiding in the shadows anymore. They were coming in full force. Sam turned toward the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver, his heart beginning to race. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his pulse spike. A figure emerging from the shadows. It was the cowboy, the same one who had warned him earlier. He was standing just outside the saloon, watching the approaching bikes with an inscrutable expression. Sam walked toward him, his boots echoing in the empty street. The cowboy didn't say anything at first. He just watched Sam approach, then nodded his head toward the oncoming bikers. "They're not just looking for a fight," the cowboy said, his voice low. "They're here to make a statement." Sam's jaw tightened. "I know, and they're not getting away with it." The cowboy took a step closer, his eyes locking with Sam's. "You're going to need more than a few rounds in that revolver to stop McCall's men. They're just the tip of the iceberg. If you're going to protect this town, you're going to have to think bigger. You'll need allies, and a plan." Sam didn't answer right away. He knew the cowboy was right. He couldn't do this alone. But there was something in the way the man spoke, the certainty in his words, that made Sam realize just how much more was at stake than he had first thought. "I'm ready," Sam said, his voice steady. The cowboy nodded. Then let's get to work. As the motorcycles roared closer, Sam felt the old thrill of the fight rise in his chest. He wasn't just a bartender anymore. He wasn't just the man hiding behind the bar and avoiding trouble. He was Red Rock's last line of defense, and he wasn't going to let McCall take it without a fight. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, the growl of engines and the rhythmic thumping of wheels against the dirt sending a wave of tension through the air. Sam turned toward the street, his eyes narrowing as the first few bikes came into view, cutting through the night like a pack of wolves. The Black Riders were here in full force, and they weren't here for a drink this time. They were here to make their statement. The cowboy stood beside Sam, his hand resting casually on the handle of a revolver, his posture relaxed but ready. Sam could feel the weight of the moment settling over him like a storm cloud about to break. The saloon, the street, the town, everything they had worked for was on the line. Sam took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the grip of his revolver. "I won't let them take it." The cowboy turned to him, his gaze steady. "We won't let them. But it's not just about guns and fists. You've got to make sure the town stands with you. You can't do this alone." Sam nodded, understanding. He had to rally the town, get everyone behind him, get them to fight for their future. The Black Riders had come to take control, to strip the people of Red Rock of everything they held dear. If Sam wanted to protect his home, he had to make sure the people weren't afraid to fight back. With a final glance at the cowboy, Sam stepped into the street. The Black Riders were coming fast now, their bikes roaring as they tore down the road, kicking up clouds of dust behind them. Sam could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had faced down outlaws and bandits before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything he had built here in Red Rock. The first of the Black Riders skidded to a stop in front of Sam, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The leader, the same man from the night before, got off his bike, his eyes locked onto Sam with pure hatred. He was still clutching his injured arm, but that didn't stop him from grinning as he stepped forward. "You've got guts, bartender," the leader growled, his voice thick with venom. "But that's all you've got. You think you can stand up to us? You think you can keep this little town safe? We're just getting started." Sam didn't flinch. He stood tall, his revolver in hand, his eyes cold and steady. "You came to the wrong town. And now, you're going to pay the price." The leader's grin faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. He reached for his gun, but Sam was faster. The shot rang out before the man could even draw, the bullet tearing through the air and striking his gun hand, sending the weapon flying. The leader staggered back, his face a mask of shock and pain. The rest of the bikers froze, their eyes widening as they realized just how fast Sam was. He had taken down their leader without a second thought, and now, the rest of them were starting to question whether they were really ready for this fight. Sam didn't give them time to think. He moved swiftly, taking cover behind the nearby wagon and firing off another shot at the nearest rider. The bullet hit its mark, the biker falling off his bike with a loud cry. The rest of the gang scrambled, pulling out their weapons and firing wildly. But Sam was already one step ahead, moving between cover with lightning speed. The cowboy beside him didn't hesitate either. He drew his own revolver, moving with deadly precision, picking off riders one by one as they tried to flank Sam. It was clear that they had underestimated both of them. The sound of gunfire filled the air, echoing through the streets, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had slowed. Each shot was deliberate, each movement calculated. Sam had done this before, but now the stakes were higher. Now it wasn't just about surviving. It was about making sure Red Rock didn't fall to the Black Riders. As the battle raged on, Sam could see the Black Riders starting to falter. They had come with arrogance, believing that their numbers and firepower would be enough to intimidate the people of Red Rock. But Sam wasn't just any man. He wasn't some quiet bartender to be pushed around. He was the deadliest shot in the West, and tonight, he was showing them why. But even as the bikers began to retreat, Sam knew it wasn't over. They wouldn't back down that easily. Jack McCall, the man pulling the strings, was still out there. And if Sam didn't deal with him soon, he'd only come back with more men, more power. The leader of the Black Riders was still on the ground, clutching his arm and cursing Sam, but he was alive. And Sam had no intention of letting him go until he got the answers he needed. Sam moved toward the leader, his steps heavy and deliberate. The remaining bikers watched warily from a distance, their weapons still raised, but they didn't dare advance. They were starting to understand. They had been outclassed. Sam wasn't just a man behind a bar. He was a force to be reckoned with. He reached the leader, who looked up at him with a mixture of pain and fury in his eyes. "You think you've won?" The leader spat, his teeth gritted. "You don't know who you're messing with. McCall's empire is bigger than you can even imagine." Sam's expression remained calm, his voice cold. "I'm not here to fight your empire. I'm here to fight for Red Rock. You can tell McCall that he can either leave this town, or we'll finish this." The leader's face twisted in rage. "You think he'll just let you walk away? You'll regret this, Bartender." McCall doesn't lose. Sam crouched down, his revolver aimed directly at the man's chest. "Tell McCall it's over. If he wants a fight, he'll get it. But not here. Not with me standing in his way." The leader's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing else. He knew Sam meant every word. Sam stood, turning his back to the leader as he walked toward the saloon. The bikers were retreating now, their bikes roaring to life as they sped away from the town. The dust settled, and for a moment, Red Rock was quiet again. But Sam knew it wouldn't last. McCall wouldn't just leave. And when the time came, Sam would have to face him head-on. But for now, Red Rock was safe. And that was all that mattered. The dust from the battle slowly began to settle, but Sam couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The Black Riders had retreated for now, but he knew they would return. Jack McCall wouldn't let it slide so easily. Sam could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just a fight for the town. This was a fight for control, for power, and McCall wasn't the kind of man to back down. The battle he had just fought was only a skirmish in the larger war that was coming. Red Rock was quiet again, but the silence was deafening. The saloon had emptied out except for a few lingering townsfolk who had watched the fight from their windows. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, and the ground was still littered with the remnants of the battle. The shells, the spent cartridges, the empty bottles that had fallen from the shelves in the chaos. Sam stood in the middle of the street, his revolver holstered at his side, his eyes scanning the horizon. The Black Riders had pulled back, but McCall's influence was still a shadow over everything. He had to finish this. He couldn't allow a man like McCall to take over Red Rock. Not after everything the town had been through. The cowboy who had been helping him walked up beside him, his boots crunching against the dirt road as he surveyed the aftermath of the fight. He had helped Sam take down the Black Riders, but he knew, as Sam did, that it wasn't over yet. "You handled that well," the cowboy said, his voice gruff but respectful. "But McCall's not done. You're gonna need more than just your gun to stop him." Sam nodded, his gaze unwavering as he looked out toward the distant hills. "I know. He's not going to let this go. Not after we humiliated his men. He'll come back with everything he's got." The cowboy glanced over at Sam, studying him for a moment before speaking again. "I know a few people. People who can help you. McCall might be big, but he's not invincible. You get the right people together, you've got a chance." Sam didn't respond immediately. The town had been quiet for so long. People had lived in fear for years, hiding from the Black Riders and the corrupt influence they spread. It wasn't until tonight that Sam had realized how much he had been avoiding the truth. McCall was a monster, but Sam wasn't going to let him take over Red Rock. The people here deserved better. "I'll need help," Sam finally said, his voice resolute. "But we do this my way. We don't play by McCall's rules." The cowboy gave a curt nod. "I'll spread the word. But you're right, McCall's not someone you want to take lightly. He's got eyes everywhere. And he doesn't care about the town. He only cares about control." "I'm not going to let him have it," Sam replied, his voice low but filled with conviction. "This town's mine. And it's not just mine, it belongs to the people who've built it. The people who've worked their whole lives to make it something. We're not going to let McCall tear it apart." The cowboy turned and started to walk toward the edge of town, but before he disappeared into the distance, he turned back to Sam. "You've got the right spirit, Bartender. But remember, it's not just guns you're going to need. You'll need to rally the people. You'll need to make them believe that they can win, because McCall's not just going to go away." Sam nodded, his mind already working on what needed to be done. "I'll do what it takes. Red Rock won't fall." The cowboy tipped his hat and turned away, his silhouette blending with the darkness as he walked into the night. Sam watched him go, then turned back toward the saloon. The streets were still quiet, but Sam knew that it wouldn't last. The Black Riders would come back. McCall would come back. And when he did, Sam would be ready. The next few days passed in a blur. Sam did what he could to prepare. He gathered what supplies he could, spoke to those who were willing to fight, and made sure that the town was ready for whatever McCall might throw at them. But it wasn't just about the weapons, the ammunition, or the tactics. It was about the people. He needed them to believe in themselves. He needed them to believe that they could fight back. He went to the general store to see Ruth, who had already started talking to the other townsfolk, convincing them to stand up. Her resolve was stronger than ever, and it was clear she wasn't going to let McCall tear apart everything they had built. "We've got enough to hold them off for a while," Ruth said, her hands busy with preparations as Sam walked into the store. "But we're going to need more." Word's already spreading about what happened. "Some people are scared, Sam. They're afraid of what McCall might do." Sam leaned against the counter, looking around the store. "They're afraid of a man who uses fear to control them. But we don't need to be afraid. We need to fight." Ruth met his gaze. "I know, but it's not just about fighting. We've got to make sure everyone's behind you. If McCall's coming, we can't just be a bunch of people with guns. We have to stand together." Sam nodded, his mind turning. "I'll talk to them. We'll make them believe that they can win. If we stand together, McCall doesn't stand a chance." The next evening, the town gathered in the middle of Red Rock, Sam standing at the front, his voice carrying over the crowd. They had heard the stories. They had heard about the Black Riders and McCall's empire. But Sam had a plan, and he needed them to believe in it. "We've all been afraid for too long," Sam said, his voice steady, strong. "But it's time to take our town back. The Black Riders and McCall think they can control us. But they can't. We're stronger than they are. And we're not going to let them take what's ours." The crowd was silent at first, but then a murmur began to grow. People started nodding, then clapping, their voices rising in unison. They weren't just afraid anymore. They were angry, and they were ready to fight. Sam's heart swelled with pride as he looked out over the crowd. These weren't just townsfolk anymore. They were fighters. They were a team. And together, they would face whatever McCall threw their way. The storm was coming, but Red Rock wouldn't back down. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.